Welcome everyone to our last day of our conference, Medievalisms on the Screen 3, Digital Medievalisms and the Teaching of History. Today we have two very interesting panels to close our conference. Our first panel, which we are having right now, is called Digital Reconstructions of Medieval Spaces. So it's very interesting because we're going to be dealing with using digital technologies to explore our medieval past and to create medieval worlds. I'm really looking forward to it. We have three very interesting papers. The first one is by Mariana Barreira. Mariana Castro Barreira completed her degree in art history with a minor in history in 2021 at the Faculty of Letters of the University of Coimbra. She is currently a master's student in history of the Middle Ages at the same institution and has a scholarship from the Foundation for Science and Technology under the project Commemortis, What Survives After Death: Parish Communities and Strategies for Commemorating the Dead in the Medieval City. The title of her paper is The Time-Link Information System in Medieval Historical Research, the Case of São Bartolomeu of Coimbra. So, Mariana, thank you very much for being here. You have 20 minutes and the floor is yours.
Okay, hello, everyone. I'm trying now to share my screen. I hope you're seeing the same as I. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the organization for giving me the opportunity to be here speaking to you about the exploratory project that I integrate. So without delays, I'll start my communication. The humanities, following the contemporary technological environment, have sought to adapt and become included in the digital world, particularly during the last 30 years. History, as a classical discipline of the humanities, has also begun to integrate the digital as a method and tool for historical research. The exploratory project Commemortis, What Survives After Death, Parochial Communities and Strategies of Commemoration of the Dead in the Medieval City, aims to test the applicability of a computing tool, Time-Link, in the study of two medieval urban parishes, São Bartolomeu and Santiago of Coimbra. While still at the work in progress stage, making it impossible to show concrete results, the current study aims, however, to present and explain the selected methodological program. Okay. The following questions seem pertinent. So, in what way can Time-Link be a viable and useful computing tool in the study of medieval communities? How is the created database structured? And what are the decisions and solutions associated with the computer notation of the obituary of São Bartolomeu of Coimbra? To achieve this presentation will begin by presenting the medieval parish, in this case, São Bartolomeu of Coimbra, and its obituary that will serve as the primary historical source. Next, the information system, Time-Link, will be demonstrated alongside of its notational formalisms. Finally, the decisive decisions for the computational transcription of the source will be addressed. So firstly, a brief spatial contextualization of medieval Coimbra, wherein the studied parish is located, is required. So Coimbra represents a typical Portuguese medieval city composed of a walled upper area where the buildings of council and military power were founded, accompanied by several ecclesiastic cells, the São Cristóvão, São Salvador, São João da Ondina, São Pedro, and finally the cathedral. This space is called the Intramuros, and the lower area bathed by a river, the Extramuros, or the suburbs. So in this area, the suburbs of Coimbra were distributed by a nuclei of population defined by four parishes: São Bartolomeu, São João de Santa Cruz, Santiago, and Santa Justa. They were structured along the path of the old Roman roads from Olisipo to Bracara Augusta. The parish of São Bartolomeu of Coimbra was characterized as a populous and industrious urban nucleus. With its privileged location near the river, at the gates of the city, it was able to accommodate both a large populace and the establishment of craftsmen and processing equipment, promoting the definition of an attractive and commercially dynamic space. In this project, the parish community of São Bartolomeu represents one of the objects of study that will be analyzed based on an interdisciplinary methodology in order to analyze its social, economic, and urban profile. One of the singularities of this project is that it seeks to launch this analysis from the city's necrological sources. Thus, the main source for this parish is the obituary of São Bartolomeu. This document is a rare specimen produced from the second quarter of the 1300s. It represents the reader with structure of a calendar, where the ceremonies to commemorate the dead were founded by men and women to some degree related to the church over a timeline of 3 centuries. The foundation of these anniversaries, like the testaments, demonstrates the double will of the founder to both ensure the eternal life of the soul and to perpetuate the earthly memory. In society in which the foundation of soul suffrage ceremonies was necessary for the salvation of the dead and the forgiveness of sins committed, the obituary fulfilled the purpose of preserving the memory of an ancestor and of guiding and encouraging religious service, in this case, in a parish context. For this complex and detailed analysis of the parish community of São Bartolomeu, based on its documentary collection, an essentially computer-based methodology of data collection was chosen, formed around an inter- and transdisciplinary dialogue intersynced to the digital humanities and the purposes of the exploratory project at the intersection of computing and historical analysis. The computer infrastructure for the analysis of the communities will be based on the time link information system developed by Joaquim Carvalho. The time link information system is a source-oriented tool, which favors the source and its meticulous notation over a computer transcription with the results in mind, and is geared towards the study of the individual, but also of the networks of relations, which are essential in characterizing communities. Databases constructed as such allow the study of large volumes of information, including that which is fragmented and/or dispersed, and decision-making based on the ingested information. Faced with the need to formalize information, the historian must consider how to represent the historical source informatically, and the tool must be flexible and reversible in the transcription and decision process, especially in the identification of people. The transcription from the source to the system follows a formal model for which people, objects, or institutions are entities with their own individual ID. The entity can be complemented with information that the source provides in the form of attributes or relations. The attributes associated with a person should be noted with the formula LS, meaning life story. It is thus understood that attributes and life story are equivalent. Both must be accompanied by their value. In that said, we cannot insert a residence without indicating its value, for example, Coimbra. So in this example that I show you, we have a good that's half a house. I'm trying to translate at the same time. So it's a good half a house that has as attribute the location of Adro of São Bartolomeu that's near the church. As I mentioned previously, the entity may also be defined by the relations it assumes with the other elements of the inscription. These relations can be very diverse. In the case of São Bartolomeu, relationships of kin, profession, and socialization were identified. Just like attributes, relations need a value to make sense. That is, it is not enough to insert a kinship relation. It is necessary to indicate the type, for example, of consanguinity. So in this example that I show you, you have 2 donors and you have a relation of merit. So you can see that Maria Flores, as a relation of kinship, has a wife of Domingos Fernandes. The purpose of the relationship definition is to create a network of relationships mentioned, and in practice, the creation of a micro-history of relationships of any kind between 2 or more IDs. So the concepts presented, entity, attributes, and relations are fundamental for the configuration of a notation that captures the content presented in the source, thus making it feasible to import it into relational database structures. Taking this model into account, it was necessary to make decisions about the form that the notation of the primary source of this project should take. Such decisions were made as a team between the lead researchers and the junior team members. As a result of these elaborations, it was possible to develop a standardized clay notation between the parishes of São Bartolomeu and Santiago that would maximize and optimize data collection in the obituary sources. The transcription begins with the CLEO statement, common to all the sources that will be cataloged, followed by the identification of the source that will be noted. In the case of obituary of São Bartolomeu of Coimbra, the process is started by defining the registration of the source, then indicating the temporal scope of the inscriptions noted, specifying the theme of the inscriptions noted, the quota of the unpublished source, and finally, since it is a transcribed and edited source, an indication of the work. After identifying the source, a decision was needed upon how to note the different inscriptions in order to create a uniform formula. The acts recording an anniversary or a death are given the name inscrição or inscription. Then an individual definition of the plate that concerns the noted inscription is made. For São Bartolomeu's obituary, obituário _ CSPC was defined, followed by the day and then month, so that each inscription corresponds chronologically. The identification of date follows, which can be an obstacle in the case of the inscriptions that make up these necrological sources, since in the most cases, the year of death is unknown. So in this case, of the 399 inscription that the source provides, only 111 have the year identified. As such, it was necessary to create a fictitious date that the software would accept without constraints. The year 0000 was not feasible, so in consensus with Dr. Joaquim Carvalho, it was defined that this would be represented by 9999. After the date, the content of the register, meaning whether it is a death certificate or an anniversary, is indicated. Finally, the location of the entry is added, which in this case is always Obituário da Colegiada de São Bartolomeu de Coimbra, with the corresponding page of the published transcription. Finally, the summary was defined. It's an element of great importance as it allows readers direct access to the content of the inscription. Occasionally, you can see OBS equals, so observations were noted in a specific field used mainly to inform the reader of any difficulties in deciphering the original text or any singularities present in the different inscriptions. Moreover, the remarks field in the format of OBS can be used in all lines of the inscriptions, whether on the entity, the attributes, or the relations. These remarks are visible to the public and provide the reader with information that, although not falling within the formal notational data structure, is relevant for understanding the content of the source. Attention should now be paid to the notation of the data present in the calendar of São Bartolomeu, considering the typology of the information it registers. So the process began with the typological division of entries in the obituary of São Bartolomeu into two types, entries of deaths and entries of anniversaries. Within each of these typologies, people, institutions, and goods were added with further interrelations as explained below. Following the information the inscription carried, the notation of individuals would be carried out based on three functions. So, donor, in Portuguese, doador or doadora, celebrated, in Portuguese, celebrado and celebrada, and referred, so referido or referida. Each subdefined by gender. That's why I interrelate with the Portuguese and English, So as the names indicate, donor should be used when it's perceptible that the subject represents the source of a donation. The group Celebrated was created specifically for this project to designate the individuals recorded with soul celebrations, but for whom the additional information that they were the donors of the heritage that supported the celebration is lacking. Finally, referred only serves to note the individuals mentioned in the document who do not enter the other categories. For example, in the obituary, this notation that I show you, we have the recurring celebration of Domingas Anjos. So she is presented as the wife of Aparício Domingos, who was the candidate of King Pedro of Portugal. In other words, Aparício Domingos and King Pedro in these inscriptions are noted only as referred. Aparício Domingos establishes a relationship of kinship as husband to Domingas Anjos and a professional relationship with King Pedro. In this case, the entity with the referred function is characterized by the relationships it establishes with the other actors. It is thus understood that the person entities assume a fundamental role for the recognition and characterization of a parish community, such as São Bartolomeu of Coimbra. In this way, the social and professional categorizations, as well as the identification of gender, are essential for the creation of the community profile, hence the highlighting and differentiation of the grammatical gender. In English, it's not so easy. So in Portuguese, we really have gender on the lexic words. So in addition to recording the celebrations of suffrage of the souls, the obituary also documents the donations made as a means of payment for anniversaries. Thus, it was established that the anniversary should be considered as independent entities, as institutions or foundations with their own ID, since they are the recipients of the donation, just like the Collegiate Church of São Bartolomeu, where they were founded. In this way, a concrete dimension is given to a concept that might initially seem abstract. The anniversaries were accompanied by information other than their own reference, comprised two additional types of registrable attributes, one that characterizes the ceremony and another that indicates the value to be distributed by the clerics or others present at the commemoration. In addition to the notation of anniversaries as donis, the Collegiate Church is equally registered as such. So the Collegiate of São Bartolomeu is noted in all inscriptions under the group of doni with an individual ID. This ID allows the creation of the social relationship of benefactor to the church, of the donor or the celebrated, and the relationship of possession of the good, which for the most part is by donation. The next decision may appear equally complex, but was taken in order to formalize elements that are mentioned in the document in a vague manner, even when there is no mention to a concrete asset or a good should always be registered. This is because even if the good is not mentioned in the inscription, its existence is considered as an absolute necessity for the payment or support of the respective foundation of the celebration. When considering the notation of specific goods, such as houses or olive groves, it is essential to record details. They may take the form of location, rent, boundaries, or descriptions. These attributes help the analysis not only of the real estate property of the parish, but also of the position of the parish of São Bartolomeu within the urban landscape. The relations associated with the possession of the goods found in the obituary are noted with the introductory formula of rel pos. This in English is relation and having. So having the goods. Subsequently, the tenor of the possession is indicated. For instance, whether it belongs or belonged, whether it was by donation, by purchase, by barter, or by construction. The standardization of these decisions, discussed both before the start of the notation process and throughout, proved essential for the understanding of and analysis of both parishes by researchers and future readership alike. The established notational language allows a reading close to the original structure and content of the document. Although results are yet to be presented, it is believed that TimeLink is a facilitating and fruitful tool with regards to the comprehension of the social networks that compose the two medieval urban parishes of Coimbra covered by this study. Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariana. That was very, very interesting, a very interesting example of how to use new digital tools to explore our medieval past. I'm sure we will have a very lively discussion during the Q&A. So now I would like to move to our second speaker, Lorenzo Mercuri. He is a PhD student in history of medieval art at the Sapienza University of Rome with a thesis focused on the Knights Templar commandery in Paris. In parallel, is a member of the International Archaeological Project Conservation of the Stone Floor of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, research and intervention for the rehabilitation, dealing and investigation on architectural reproductions of the Holy Sepulchre in Western Europe between the 12th and the 13th centuries. He's also a visiting fellow at the University of Nantes, visiting fellow at the Nottingham University in 2023. His research interests concern sacred, residential, and military architecture promoted by military orders in Latin, East, and Western Europe. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan. I will share the PowerPoint. That's okay. Do you see it? Okay, so a grim tall cluster of gloomy towers. With these few walls taken out of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Victor Hugo described the Knights Templar commander in Paris. Beyond the well-known story with which we are familiar, one of the key themes of the novel was the concerning the Parisian architecture, that in Hugo's period was suffering heavy modification or even demolitions. Between those monuments erased in the capital by history, the Maison du Temple was perhaps the largest and the most impressive. Built up from the 50s of 12th century in the northern periphery of Paris, the Templars' commandery had gradually turned into the principal headquarter of the order in Europe, but not only for its ramparts wall provided with flanking towers, for the several monastic structures and a huge round chapel, but also for its two main defensive towers, the Tour de César, here on the left, and the Grosse Tour on the right, that kept the French crown royal treasure. The entire estate passed in without too many damages into the possession of Knights of Malta after Templars' process in early 14th century. But between the end of 18th century and the beginnings of 19th, it was definitively dismantled by the will of Napoleon, perhaps because in the recent past it was used as prison for French kings. For all these reasons, the topic seemed to be extremely attractive for a PhD thesis, especially because the chosen subject has been completely neglected or improperly faced by scholars. Nevertheless, and beside the investigation of building phases, since the beginning, I thought that sharing in some easy way the lost monuments was a mandatory task. The right chance came accidentally in 2022, when I was contacted by Simonetta Cerrini asking me to help her in the realization of a documentary on Knights Templar architecture. The aim of the documentary, entitled Les Templiers, la démesure des bâtisseurs, was to show Knights Templar architecture in Europe by selecting some cases that could represent their spiritual duality. On one hand, their military role, like the Miravet Castle in Catalonia, Spain, or the stronghold of Tomar in Portugal, or perhaps also their religious faith, as the Temple Church in London, or their estate possessions in France, as the commandery of La Couverturoide in Occitania. Maybe the Maison du Temple was the most difficult to face and to promote, because it was both banished and not investigated yet. Despite these lacks, there were plenty of useful data to try a digital reconstruction. First of all, the graphical sources. From 15th century illumination made by Jean Fouquet to other lesser known, from the most ancient bird-eye views to the more accurate zenithal plans of 18th century, in almost every representation of the city, the Knights Templars commandery marked the landscape. In addition to this, a series of cadastral maps of the entire complex could be useful to establish with accuracy dimensions and distances between the lost buildings. To complete the knowledge, there were further written documents, as the visiting reports dating from Knights of Malta period, in which building conditions are described in detail. But also the archaeological surveys, for example, that from the beginning of 12th century carried out in the area, or still plenty of lithographs. However, there was an underlying problem. All these drawings, paintings, sketches are univocal representation in which what is shown and what we can see is something that has been previously selected by the author and not always match the reality. That in addition changed over the years. For this reason, the sole way to reach a correct reconstruction was to mix all the information with the historical data collected and removing the addition realized in modern times on medieval buildings. Let's start, for example, with the sources used to write the boundary wall. There was the well-known etching of the commandery realized for the Cloche-Chastillon Topographie Française in mid-17th century, in which the external crenellated ramparts appear uniformly buttressed between two corner towers, one that on the left starting from the ground, the other on the right starting from a moderate height. Nevertheless, the representation was too much cursory to be useful for our purpose. For this reason, other sources should have been considered. Between these, in a drawing made by Israel Silvestre, depicting the Rue du Temple, the author included the buttress wall and the Justine Tower without the basis. Now that more visual data were taken, a comparison with some existing architecture or the research of any survived remain was needed to close the investigation. For an existing and similar monument, there was the not so much distant 500 meters priory of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, with its flanking towers on the north external defensive wall still preserved. On the other hand, known towers of the Templar ramparts have survived, due to the fact that the most part of these were dismantled to raise up new buildings or to open new roads. But the northeast corner tower is a superb exception. Properly recorded by the cadastral map known as the Atlas Vassero, as set between the 73 Rue Charlotte and the 32 Rue de la Picardie, its existence was once again detected in 1926 during some archaeological surveys, when the outstanding wall of 4 meters diameter was found. The same method, by using the topographical views of the city and the cadastral map of the Maison, was adopted to correctly set the complex in the Parisian GIS coordinates, to raise different monastic structures, as refectories, chapter house, dormitories, and to rebuild the entrance door gate, with 2 flanking towers, as you can see now in the video. About the military and residential elements, as the most ancient tower, the Tour de César, sources inform about its square shape, buttress in the corner and at the middle of the walls, on its side, but not about its windows or arrow slits, for which the drawings are not reliable for their modern and large aspect. Likewise, the roof was a modern addition of the medieval crenellated top level of the 2 floors towers, and our slits were opened only on the 2nd floor, both on the northern and on the southern side, as could be inferred by those drawings I showed you earlier. More information concerns the biggest tower in the south area of the complex, the Grosse Tour. Built up in 12th century to host the royal treasure, it started to be the main symbol of the commandery, being used in late 13th century seal of the Parisian Templar treasurer that show its original appearance, without the side block added under hospitaller control. And perhaps for this stunning importance given from earliest time, it is the most represented monument inside the Maison du Temple, with sketches, painting, and most of all, detailed plans and sections, through which it was possible to know it in every detail. Even in this case, the large dimension of the windows support a modern modification, and as we will subsequently see, the northern side, that where was built the hospitaller addition, has been recreated following the layout of other faces. Last point, the spiral staircase was in the northwestern corner tower, so that externally the windows arrangement of this tower was inevitably different compared to the other towers. We are informed too about the presence of tiles and plumbed roof for the central square tower and for the corner towers, provided the last one with a small talus in the lower part. Since the documentary part of the Parisian Maison du Temple was focused on Knights Templar residential and military architecture, in addition to their role as bankers for Capetian sovereigns, in the commandery reconstruction, there are 2 parts partially neglected: the chapel and the cloister that surrounded it on the northern, western, and southern side. They have been certainly reconstructed with correct forms and set in the right position inside the estate, but a detailed view is missing. Helpful elements result from this etching realized by Jean Marot from the south front of the demolished cloister, in which the religious building showed itself in all its length, but also in this case, should be eliminated all modern additions. For the original Templar phase belong only the round part, architectural reproduction of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, the chancel and the apse in the east part, the belfry, and the porch on the west side, whereas all those chapels, blue colored, were built from the end of 15th century. This is also true for the cloister windows, for which there is in this detailed engraving made by the same author a detailed description. In parallel, different attempts pursued before the realization of the 2022 documentary were more focused on the chapel and on monastic buildings. The first of this reconstruction was made by the Center for Digital Humanities of the University of California. The project, Paris, Past and Present, coordinated by Meredith Cohen, aimed to digitally reconstruct selected lost monuments of medieval Paris. What can be seen for the Templar Chapel raises some questions. Besides some mistakes as the excessive number of windows and buttresses in the upper part of the church, it is not clear on which basis they rebuilt the interior part of the porch, if the only view of it is this I am showing you, concerning the lower level. Perhaps its connection with the Gothic architecture raised up in 30s of 13th century may allow this hypothesis, but they cannot be demonstrated for either graphical or written sources. Another reconstruction concerning the entire Maison du Temple, but now as declared by authors mainly referred to the mid-16th century status of the commandery, is that realized by the Greeks' reproduction. The work made in which the entire city of Paris has been remodeled in 3 dimensions has a stunning high-quality view, with the addition of all these stunning walking people inside the complex. But I remember that inside the monastery, not all people were allowed to enter, so I don't understand all this crowd. On the other hand, different buildings are represented in their 16th century appearance by adding the Knights of Malta modification, but there are plenty of mistakes. A building prominence in the chapel north side with a rose never existed. The belfry flash in the middle of the presbytery roof, the porch with a sole interior level, or also the cloister with these strange windows that never existed. The sole case in which it is possible to openly explore the commandery is that realized for a game series that you may have heard about, Assassin's Creed. The 8th installment, Assassin's Creed Unity, was released in 2014, and the gameplay is set in Paris during the French Revolution. That is, some moments before the final disappearance of the Templar complex. As said in an interview shortly before the game release, the aim of the digital reconstruction carried out by Ubisoft modelers was not the perfectly historical accurate reconstruction. The ramparts are effectively different from those that were existent in the French Revolution period, as like the flooded ditch filled with water never existed, but that is a typical feature of an unconquerable fortress. Those moldings that mark the corner and central towers the buttress of the central tower, and this type of large windows are far from reality too, but are useful for climbing to the tower where the character must carry out the mission and from which, as it is customary to do, she dives into the hay. It's a shame that in such a good opportunity as could be an almost open world as that in Assassin's Creed Unity, the reconstruction was not completely correct. Although if it is a good case that permits to work inside the estate shortly before it could not more be permitted. It is the French Revolution period, the best known period for the commandery, since there are plenty drawing of the imprisoned King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette inside the gross too, that needed to be rearranged to host these high-ranked prisoners. I would like to say, to conclude my presentation, that a great task remained to be done. Naturally, none of this digital reconstruction can be an exact replica of the original monument. Even if the study of the source's architecture is detailed, whatever could be the period chosen or the high quality of the 3D model, those elements lost cannot be fully regenerated. Nevertheless, these attempts can imply different matters. First, they can be a knowledge method to approach an architectural topic, since too many times scholars are focused on written and graphical sources, forgetting the three-dimensionality of these buildings, feature that, carefully observed, can allow new parallelism and divergences through the investigation. On the other hand, by presenting an open world model in which the user can freely explore the created space, it can enable to non-specialists the view of something that is often difficult to imagine. But there are numerous risks. Create an explorable world without an accurate reconstruction, or a non-explorable world with high render quality but not belonging to the desired period, or forgetting some buildings, or even worse, buildings with a shining appearance but empty inside. These are all the chance to carry out a complete and navigable 3D model of the Maison du Temple of Paris, by virtue of numerous drawings of the structure's interior, and I hope soon new studies about architectural phases, by including different professional competences with aim of showing one more and as accurate as possible the lost headquarter of Knights Templars in Paris. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. That was really a fascinating project. I will have some questions later because I am very intrigued by the multiple set of disciplines and abilities that must be behind fully reconstructed digitally such a complex architectural structure. We will get to that in a while. So now I would like to introduce our last panelist for our first panel of the day, James Baillie, who I'm very glad to see. He's a recurrent presence here in our conference. He's a doctoral student at the University of Vienna and project staff member at the Iranian Studies Department of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. His work is primarily focused on digital data structuring for models of the medieval world and the history of the medieval Caucasus region. He also writes on the reception of the medieval period in modern games and is an active computer and tabletop game developer. He's a co-convener of the Medieval Caucasus Network and convener of the Coding Medieval Works workshop series, which connects historians and game developers. James' paper is entitled The Uncreativity Engine, AI Tools in Popular Medievalist World Building. So James, feel free to take it from there, and the floor is yours.
Okay, it seems to have jumped to the middle of the talk. So, right, you're all now saying slide 1, yes? Okay, good. Right, quite a lot to get through here, so let's get on with it. So, large language models. We had one talk about them already this conference. Basically, I'm going to take you through in this talk some of the basics of how these things work as a very brief overview. And then I'm going to talk about some of their likely uses in world building around the medieval and people's perceptions of it, and how those things might impact one another in the coming years. So what is a large language model? This is one of the things that a lot of people are now referring to as AI. I think AI is a slightly overdrawn term for what these things are and what they're doing. Essentially, what a large language model is a system for spitting out a predictive text, essentially. So a large language model is based on a neural network. It's based primarily on text. These are generic models that can do multiple tasks, and they're trained on huge data sets. In particular, we've all been hearing about Bard and ChatGPT, and it's those sorts of models that I'm focusing on today. So these models get information in the form mostly of text. They can produce text, and because they have this capacity to recombine and write new text, essentially on a probabilistic basis, it's sort of how likely are these words to appear next to each other is the fundamental algorithm behind it. There is a capacity for producing new text, and so the question arose pretty fast of, so can you do creative works with this? And people have been going and trying to do exactly that. So there is clearly interest. There have been some like breathlessly hype articles about people playing D&D with ChatGPT, DMing them. You see this thing I found on a website saying AI generated world building, the future of inspiration. And then here's a tweet from somebody who was, just trying to do it on a day-to-day basis. So this is actually filtering kind of down into the sorts of people who are building medieval settings, ideas, worlds, and that's something we should be thinking about. So how do they work? So this is large-scale digital data. It's important to note that this is solely a linguistic model based on the relationships between words and tokens in it. On that basis, it can generate blocks of text and computer code. Tools like GPT also have post-hoc or trained restrictions on them to try and avoid problem outputs. And this is a very large part of the problem of large language models and AI in general is if you try and put a huge amount of what humans have written into a model, it turns out that humans have written a lot of things that are either terrible or garbage or both. And the model doesn't have a fundamental way of telling those apart, so it often needs to have these quite specifically post hoc trained restrictions into it. This is a very quick run through what's happening under the surface. This is a system called a generative adversarial network. So it's trained in cycles between a generator function and a discriminator function. Basically, you start with the monkeys on a typewriter thing. The generator creates an entirely random fake output. The discriminator attempts to distinguish it from the real ones. And these then train each other in cycles. The quality and quantity of training data are key. You need large quantities of data for these to work. And also, as I just noted, the if you put garbage in, you will get garbage out. And because of the sheer quantities of data that something like GPT is being trained with, you cannot manually work through all the data. So either you need to find ways to train the AI to recognize data from a subset, or you need to or you need to put on like much more manual post hoc restrictions to the interface. So to give an example of a couple of the things that it struggles with, this is the slide where I get to talk to you briefly about buts. The word but appears a lot of times in the English language for a lot of different purposes, which are actually all etymologically distinct. There is an archery butt, the human butt, headbutting things, water or wine butts, a spear butt. These actually all come in from different languages. Butt appears to be to the English language what crabs are to arthropod evolution. At some point, our descendants are just going to speak a version of English that's purely this word. But this is something that GPT struggles with because there's a bunch of different forms of this word. They're all visually the same, and it doesn't have a concept framework underneath it. It can approximate a concept framework from the context that the words appear in, but without a context or with a limited context, it can struggle. So, and this is doubly a problem in this case because one form of the word but is vastly more common in its data set than all of the others. So, you know, a sentence like he shot the butt is actually more likely in GPT's assessment to be somebody being shot in the human butt than an archery butt, just because of the sheer volume of butts in its data set of that particular type. Another example of the kind of thing that it struggles with, which I think highlights some of the problems with how it works, is if you switch a familiar riddle to a slightly different wording, that will confuse it because the input it's getting is very similar, like in terms of structure, to something it has a given answer for. So, for example, if you there is the riddle about the man who's going to St. Ives with 7 cats and 7 wives and so on. And the standard answer to the riddle is 1 because you met because the question is how many people are going to St. Ives. The answer is you because you were the only person going the other way and you met him on the way. But if you change the riddle to say that you overtook him on your way to St. Ives, such that there were like 400 of you on the way there, GPT can't notice that because the whole rest of the structure of the text is something it's got a lot of hits and a lot of familiarity with. And so it will struggle to distinguish the change of word. Same thing if you give it like the who walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the day and 3 legs in the evening, the riddle of a human life cycle. If you change it to 4 legs in the morning, 4 legs in the day and 4 legs in the evening and tell it it's a dog, it will start getting very confused and tell you that, well, maybe dogs need 4-legged walking sticks. So what does all this mean? A large language model output gives you, this is the most plausible sequence of words to answer this question. There is no abstract conceptual capacity behind that. The conceptual capacity solely comes from how these words relate to one another. So words and their associations make a good heuristic for a concept framework, but it is imperfect. And more problematically, it's much better at solving a problem that's already been solved. This is both true for coding and true for text. The closer it's really quite good at producing something it's effectively seen before, and becomes much worse at producing something that's further away from what it's seen before, which has obvious repercussions for creativity, which I will now move on to. So, for the next bit, I'm going to talk through some experiments I've been doing with GPT. So the first of these is a word association experiment. I took the prompt, I'd like you to give me a list of 10 words that are all things you associate with the medieval world. So the idea is this simulates the range of associations available for medieval as a sort of baseline concept. As well as asking GPT this question, I asked a group of professional medievalists, and I asked a group of creative professionals and amateurs who are doing things with the medieval world, but weren't themselves professional historians. So we've got two groups of humans and one group of AI. One group of large language model. In each case, it's a sample of 15. So 15 medievalists, 15 creators, and 15 different contexts for GPT. So effectively, every time you sort of start a new chat with GPT, you've wiped the slate clean. It's a new context. Contrary to what some people think, GPT does not learn from human inputs as it's going. This attempt has been tried with AI once or twice. It turns out that if you put a large language model on the internet and say, this will learn from whatever you tell it, then people basically manage to make it be racist within about 48 hours. So that's a bit of a non-starter in the large language model field, which is why GPT, I mean, the P stands for pre-trained. So, word associations. As you might be able to guess, this is our medievalist group, which is why it has manuscript as the most popular word in the middle of it. So the maximum any word can appear here is 15 times, unless somebody put it on their own list multiple times. And so, yeah, this is our map of how a bunch of medievalists think about the medieval world. And so we've got some, key things: war, monasticism, plague. If you look into the smaller words, there's a big array of things, including, art, faith, but vassalage, chivalric romance, poetry, but also things that, like science or cold or gold. There's some kind of quite lateral connections that can come in here from the scholars who did this. And we see a similar thing, albeit with a very different pattern, here with our map for the creatives. So here it's castles that are the central visual concept that pops out immediately. But one thing I found really interesting is that the creators actually had a wider total array of words than the scholars did. Partly because several of them actually put entirely adjective-based lists together. The idea that the medieval world was rough or colourful or sociable or smoky. These things that kind of are there to evoke feeling as concepts, as well as the sort of more physical and visual elements. So that's our two human groups. And this is what we get out of our large language model. Basically, as you can see, it's very, very much narrower in terms of the number of total words we're getting out of it. It's giving a small number of very high hit, very standard tropes, essentially, about the medieval world. So it's giving a much narrower view. It's not taking us on any interesting side paths necessarily. It's saying, you want medieval? This is what the average medieval looks like to the training data set. And again, that process of always getting the most high probability, most average answer out gives us this very much more restricted view of what the model is going to say about the Middle Ages. So what happens if we try it on a slightly more complex creative test? For this, I decided to get it to produce some deities for dark elves. Dark elves are a concept in a lot of modern medieval fantasies, notably the Elder Scrolls, Dungeons & Dragons, and Warhammer. The reason I picked them for this is that they have a fairly tight, consistent set of tropes. Dark elf societies tend to be portrayed as a strict inversion of the Tolkien-esque elf, so that they have a sort of things around blood, sacrifice, shadows, secrets, spiders. They're sort of they still have that kind of elite elf thing, but they're very much, dark aesthetic. And also there are often some other things that are continuities with the different forms of dark elves that people have created. They tend to be matriarchal, for example. And there's a very small number of key examples of dark elf deities that are likely to be in ChatGPT's training set. So part of the question is it just going to spit these same things out? So D&D has Lolth, this sort of spider deity, and the night goddess Shah. Warhammer has a sort of blood and sacrifices deity, Cain. So what do we find? So I basically got it to produce 20 different Dark Elf deities and did some calculations of the percentage of them that had different tropes and ideas associated with them. Interestingly, given what I was saying about Lolth being a spider deity and by far the most well-known Dark Elf deity, spiders only appeared once. And that one time it basically just created Lolth with the serial numbers filed off. But GPT doesn't do that very often. Actually, what it does is significantly more boring somehow. It creates deities that have a very, very standard set of word association tropes that it will associate closely with this idea of dark and elf. So darkness itself, like deities of darkness, 85% of the ones it generated had this trait. Coming only under being a deity of shadows, which was 90%. Literally half of them had a name beginning with the letter Z. Well over half of them had sacrifices. So you have this effectively very standard set of ideas. And remember, the prompt I gave it did not specify any of these things. I literally just said, my setting has some dark elves in. Can you produce a deity for them? So again, it's taking, oh, you've got dark elves, and ensuring that the dark elves are put very heavily back in the dark elf box. So it's reinforcing and regurgitating some of the ideas that society is already going to have around this particular concept, and it's making them much stronger in its outputs. And to give an idea of how that might affect things in a way that is a bit more tangible than, oh, well, Dark Elves, they're not real, I also tried a set of creating some villains. I said I'm going to create a medieval fantasy setting with 20 Persian and Arabic and another 20 attempts for Viking and Norse themes. I need a villain for my heroes to face. Can you create and describe one for me? Again, these were sets of 20 and with a comparison of traits produced. And things happened about as you would probably expect. And of course you'd expect that because these are the very stock tropes we have around all these things. There were some things that were shared, so both sets of villains were vastly predominantly male. But what we also see is, you know, the Persian Arabic set, half of them were scheming viziers or royal advisors. One of the Norse ones was mentioned in the same light. The Persian Arabic set, 60% of them had some kind of magical powers. It's vastly higher than the Viking and Norse set. Conversely, 80% of the Viking and Norse villains had their physical combat prowess mentioned, compared to half that for the Persian and Arabic set. Raiding mentioned about all, over half of the Viking Norse villains, not mentioned once in the Persian and Arabic set. Believe me, as a scholar of the Middle East, this is not because nobody raided anybody in the medieval Near East in the medieval period. And more problematically and perhaps more worryingly, this also comes over in the sort of mental traits that these people are being given. So the Persian and Arabic set have a noticeably higher tendency towards being the sort of scheming, plotting type of villain. The Viking and Norse set are given the term ruthless a lot more of the time. So we, again, have these tropes and indeed stereotypes being regurgitated very willingly by GPT. And GPT has blocks on to try and avoid it giving you like stereotypes. If you ask it, what are stereotypes about Persian people? It has a manual block to say it would be wrong to stereotype Persian people. You ask it to create a Persian-style villain, and you get a cackling vizier plotting to use his magic against the Sultan. So herein lies the problem. So, hence the title of this talk. Welcome to the Uncreativity Engine. GPT is likely to narrow the range of answers people get. It doesn't necessarily copy singular exemplars, but it still does average out to repetitive and similar results. One thing I didn't note on the previous screen is that whilst only, I think, 15% of my Norse villains were female, 35% of them were called Ragnar. So you have this repetitive structure coming back, and it will feed the most common training results back to people. Thus, large language model output makes it harder, the more people are using it, to broaden their views of medieval fictions, but therefore also the medieval past more widely. And that, I think, is one of the problems we really need to think about with how it's being used going forwards, particularly as it gets used for things like Dungeons and Dragons DMing. I think it is very likely that major companies will be putting out systems for play D&D with the computer in the coming years. And we can see some of the issues with that in terms of it reinforcing ideas about what these worlds are going to look like. Which is something that I think a lot of us, particularly someone like me as a scholar of areas outside, the standard Western European idea of medieval, that's something that I have some concerns about. And we've seen from the Persian and Norse example that it can reinforce, in some cases, quite negative stereotypes of medieval histories and peoples. One thing that people will ask is, well, can't GPT just improve? One thing that I'm sure any average GPT user will critique from what I've just done here is your prompt engineering was terrible. It's true, my prompt engineering was terrible. As somebody who often has to stand up in front of groups of historians and talk to them about computers, a system is about as good as its least capable user. You can't rely on people having high quality prompt engineering in all of their systems. User training is good, don't get me wrong, but prompt engineering is not a solution in and of itself to these problems. There is possibly potential for GPT to effectively learn pattern creativity by getting inputs on, this feels creative compared to this data set. You could produce some training processes with that. It's possible it will happen. I think we don't know how good the possibilities are there, but also they don't necessarily solve some of the fundamental underlying problems of the input data, particularly as there becomes more pressure to pipe more and more data into things like GPT to improve them. More data may not be an improvement, especially when you're trying to effectively pipeline the internet into this thing. There are a lot of things on the internet, and that's as far as I think any of us need to take that line of thinking. There are also future problems ahead for GPT-type systems, one of which is that whilst, for example, GPT-4 is much more robust than the GPT-3 I was using for these tests, it's also vastly more processor hungry. It's rate limited for the people who pay to use it at the moment, and that's essentially because it's much larger capacity to take in larger blocks of text. Because of the way the connections in these networks work, it exponentiates the processing power you need, which could be a major problem for the continued growth of these systems. We also haven't even hit some of these problems, like as people start doing internet scrapes into AI, that means people are going to put things on the internet for the express purpose of getting AIs to pick them up, whether that is trying to get adverts thrown into your AI outputs, or whether that's trying to get malicious code thrown into your AI outputs. There is a whole area there that we've not even scratched the surface of. And finally, there are still some legalities around this tech that are unclear. For example, who is responsible when GPT says entirely wrong information about a living person? There is, I believe, currently a case in Australia where a local mayor who was a whistleblower was accused by GPT outputs of doing the crime that he was the whistleblower on. It's easy to see how the model produced that association. It's also libel. So I think there are a lot of potential issues there to think about. And so finally, what do we do? I think one thing we need to do is making the case more strongly for part of our mission as academics being public information, and that's outside just the realm of classroom teaching. I think we cannot sort of wait for classroom teaching groups of students to filter through into the general population to solve problems like this. The technology is simply moving faster than that will allow for. Of course, we should be aware of these dangers and flag them to students, and I hope that today's talk has given you an idea of what some of those are. I think it's important to note that how to use GPT is far less key at this point than how not to. The thing we should be nervous about at the moment is not hyper-intelligent AI taking over the world. It is really not at all intelligent large language models making massive errors about the world and filtering them through into the general public. And finally, a thing that's very close to my heart is that we should seek more direct academic to creative collaborations. So effectively, we shouldn't be having people rely on the large language model systems for aggregating their information if we can help them not do it. And I think that's one of these areas where, yes, wider public engagement is one thing, but also finding the people who are creating around medieval ideas and medieval worlds and making, the much wider variety of ideas that we can access as scholars about the Middle Ages accessible to them is a hugely important way of, re-expanding the word cloud and building a wider idea of the Middle Ages. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, James. It was a very interesting, it's a very intriguing topic, how this, what we more colloquially call AI, is going to end up impacting on not only how we imagine the past, but also how we act it in some form. Okay, so we have roughly 15 minutes for our Q&A session. So again, for our audience, remember that you can either raise your hand or write your questions in the chat. We also do encourage our panelists to ask questions to one another in case you have questions. But in the meantime, then I guess I'll get the conversation going with my first set of questions. And I want to begin maybe by asking Lorenzo about his presentation. What you presented is incredibly interesting, right? Because I think it's a very good example of how to use different forms of sources to try to recreate a medieval space in a digital world. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the whole team that lies behind the project, because it seems to me that you require so many different types of abilities. You need, of course, historians who interpret the source for you, but also graphic designers who know how to use these programs, architects who actually know about architecture and can tell you, okay, this would work this way or this would not work this way. So I would like to maybe ask if you could expand about how these multiple abilities and these multiple these multiple abilities that you need to put into dialogue with one another in order to be able to reconstruct this type of space. And on the side to that, how would you probably compare it to, for example, what you mentioned about the case of Assassin's Creed Unity? Because, of course, the way in which Assassin's Creed Unity is constructing its Paris has a particular purpose, which is very gamified. As you mentioned, many of the elements are simply to make climbing possible within the game. So I would like to tell us a little bit about how does this process of designing the whole thing work within your project with these multiple talents, and maybe how would you think this could compare to other forms of reconstructions, be it the Assassin's Creed one or the UCLA one that you also mentioned?
Yeah, the task was very difficult because I was contacted like 2 years ago from Simonetta Cerrini because she wanted to do this documentary on Templars architecture in Europe. and she decided to show some important cases like the Temple Church in London, the Miravet Castle in Catalonia, the Tomar complex in Portugal that maybe Mariana Barreira has visited, and also other buildings. And to do such a good study and a good showing about this monument, she selected for every monument 2 or 3 scholars. For example, in this case of the Maison du Temple of Paris, she selected Philippe Josserand, that is an historian on Templars in France. Also Geneviève Etienne, that she's also a scholar, not in the academic world actually, but she's specialized on Templars presence like landowners in the city of Paris. And she contacted me because I'm doing the PhD thesis on the Maison du Temple. My thesis is on history of art and history of architecture. So I'm studying all these graphical documents. And for this reason, we started by studying the written sources, because there are a lot of documents, as I showed you. And there is also 2 main books, one written by Baillie, that is a person that used to live in the commandery shortly before it was demolished. So he viewed the monument still standing. And the other is Henri de Courson, that wrote a big book, the Soul book, on the monograph of the commandery, that is a 200 pages books, quite heavy. And from this, we started with my skills on military sacred architecture in France between 12th and 13th century, growing up what could be the reality of that period, eliminating all the mistakes made by other reconstructions, and all this data that we had, we sent to those people that were with the computer doing the 3D model. And it was quite difficult because sometimes they send us another time the reconstruction with a lot of mistakes. So we had to argue a lot of times, but at the end, I think that the work done is quite good. It's not complete, but it's quite good. Relating with the other reconstruction and with the choices that they made, I think that every representation is useful for the person that created. For example, we wanted to represent how was the commandery in the 13th century. The others wanted to represent the commandery in the 16th century, or maybe the commandery during the French Revolution. But representing the commandery during the French Revolution inside a game, it means that it must be explorable, and also to explore it, you must modify the reality. For this reason, I think that they modified a bit all the buildings. Also, when I was younger, I used to play with other games of the Assassin's Creed series. And also they recreate some parts of Rome in the game number 3, I don't remember the name, and about Constantinople, about Jerusalem, and all these buildings are for the 90% true, but there is that 10% that has been modified to be a better game, to be useful for the gameplay.
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Lorenzo. Again, remember that if you have questions, you can write them in the chat or raise your hand. But in the meantime, then I have a question for Mariana. Again, thank you for your presentation. It's also a very interesting project. Now, I come from the perspective of a person who literally doesn't know anything about programming. But I would like to ask you a little bit about the source that you're using, the obituary. So as I understood from your, and you can correct me, of course, the idea of the project is to create a database using this obituary about donations, relations between individuals that are there and such, right? But I would like then to ask if you could expand about the source itself, which type of information it got, because I see that in one of your entries, one of the persons who were being, that you were entering into the database was somehow related to King Pedro, if I remember, right? Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you a little bit about that. So what is the source about? Which type of information mainly can we find in the source? And what type of venues of research do you think this database can open to? Microhistory, history from above? Like, yeah, that would be my question.
Okay, so this source, it mainly represents the low community, so the poor people that are present in the parish context of the suburbs of Coimbra. So normally in the suburbs of the Portuguese cities, you have the lower income, the poor people, so the Americans, the craftsmen. So those are the people that I'm trying to understand and to communicate to them, to try to write history. And this is the microhistory that the source provides. So it mainly has 409 inscriptions, and all of these inscriptions, you only have mainly poor people. They are not poor because they are founding some anniversary. So in that way, they have to have some goods to give to the church to found the ceremony. So these are the people that I'm trying to understand. The relation about the King Pedro is, as I said, is only the referred to. So the person that is celebrating is Domingas Anjos. So she is the wife of, I don't really remember, Aparício Domingos. So Aparício Domingos is working to King Pedro as candeeiro. We really don't know what it means to be candeeiro. Maybe he was the one lighting the candles, but we don't really know what's the profession right now. That's the only relation that we have with King Pedro. That's a top person in the reign of Portugal. So we don't really talk about people that have that kind of status, the high status in Portugal. Only the parishioners of the parish of São Bartolomeu. The other question was about, I'm sorry, I really can't remember.
About the venues of research that you see this.
Okay, yeah.
Which I mean, it's very much, I mean, as what I'm getting from your answer, it's great because it allows us to make history from below, which is often very difficult to do, right?
Yeah, so this information system was already applied to three other investigations in history here in Arts and Humanities Faculty of Coimbra. So the two first ones were in modern time. Only the third one was in medieval temporal scope. So we are now trying to integrate two more parishes. So until now we studied one parish, medieval parish in Coimbra, Santa Justa. So now me and my colleague, we are trying to add two more parishes, medieval parishes of Coimbra, and I think the impetus to this investigation and trying to try the applicability and the utility in historic analysis is just to put there online all the information, in this case in the medieval sources online, so that everyone can see. So it will be public to the reader. And in that way, you can now read a source that's from the 11th century or the 12th century online and everywhere in the world. So what we are trying to do is to put every source about these parishes, these medieval parishes, online, so everyone can read all around the world.
That's amazing, Mariana. It's really a great project. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
If there are no other questions, then I do have a question for James. Yesterday in our last panel, one of the topics that came up precisely was the use of these large language models, or more colloquially AI programs, to teach the Middle Ages and also to research them. And I would like, I mean, you clearly have a better understanding of how these systems work, that at least certainly better than me. And one of the things that kind of angsts me when I think about this type of programs is precisely what you mentioned. In the end, these are not like actual thinking AIs who get to learn, but are very much restricted by what you put into the whole system. And considering the experiments that you carried out, what I would like to ask you is, how do you see the potential use of these type of tools by researchers when we are exploring the Middle Ages, considering the many medievalist ideas that it can end up reproducing, as you very clearly illustrated? Also considering that in the end, this is a type of technology that is just starting, right? In the end, we have to see where it potentially can go to. But again, since you understand more about these than certainly than me, I would like to know your opinion.
So yeah, in terms of the future of where these can go, I think one just has to be a bit wait and see about some aspects of it, because I think essentially it's likely that at some point this technology is kind of going to plane off in its effectiveness, but we don't know when that's going to be. It may be that we find that a mix of processing capacity shortages and legal problems are going to stall this out within the next year or two. It may be that, these things will keep getting better. I think from the perspective of research use, what you can do with them is, at least at the moment, extremely limited, because essentially, because everything that they're putting out requires a degree of double checking, it would often be faster to just try and find the things that it will tell you about via another source to begin with that you can rely on better. And it will, the term that given sometimes is hallucination, which again I think is imputing it a more like humanoid mindset than it has. But it will certainly, make up information to fill in gaps, because what it's trying to do is write plausible sentences that would be indistinguishable from something a human had wrote. But that doesn't necessarily mean those sentences are in any objective sense true. So yeah, for amusement's sake, I put into it not very long ago, what are the most important contributions made by the medievalist scholar James Baillie, and it told me that I'd written a very important book on the entire history of the Caucasian peoples, published in 1938. Which would have been very impressive as someone who was born in 1994, but and equally, it will produce seemingly plausible attempts at explaining things that are entirely nonsensical to any field specialist because they look, you know, for example, another thing I tried to do was get it to talk about the Georgian medieval epic, The Knight in Panther Skin, and it has, you know, some basic frameworks information about this from its training set, but it will gobble them in a way that looks perfectly plausible if you don't know about it. But so for any kind of basic research purpose, I would always prefer to actually just be following, you know, human written source to human written source for the time being. You know, I think short of I want to draft an email really quickly, like that's the level that GPT, you know, maybe has use on if you're somebody who, you know, has mental blocks on email writing. But yeah, generally I think its information content is not something I would trust as far as I can throw it, and as it cannot physically be thrown, I would advise against trusting it at all.
Okay, thank you very much, James. We're a little bit over the time, but I want to just ask if anybody in the audience has a question or a comment that you would like our panelists to address really quickly. I think there are not. So, okay, so I think then we can bring the panel to a close. Again, thank you to Mariana, James, and Lorenzo. This has been a really fascinating panel. I'm really intrigued by how we can use these new technologies for multiple purposes, although I really don't know much about programming and this kind of stuff. But it has been really great. So for the rest of you, we will have our last panel of the conference in roughly 25 minutes. The Middle Ages in Popular and Digital Media, Approaches to Gender. Again, you can use this very same link to access the last panel, and we hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.